Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's PMI Friday webinar, The Psychology of 5S with Damion Albinson. My name is Rich Seddon, and I'll be facilitating today's session. It's wonderful to have you with us. Please do use the Q&A functionality. I'll be manning the Q&A desk throughout today's session, and also the chat functionality within the Zoom call, which can be found in your toolbar. And I'll put your questions throughout the session to Damion as we proceed. Today's webinar is being recorded, and as usual, we'll send you a link via email early next week to the full recording of both the audio and the presentation, so you'll get to see where the slides too. And as usual, we're broadcasting live on Facebook and LinkedIn. To those joining us on the live streams, welcome. To be able to participate in polls, receive the recording via email, and make suggestions for future topics, please do register for the webinars at the web address, which is on screen at the moment, pmi.co.uk/webinars. And I'm delighted to let you all know that we have yesterday published the December schedule for webinars as well. So running right up until to the middle of December. Finally, before we get underway, after the webinar, we'll send all registered participants a Voice of the Customer survey. We'd be really grateful for your feedback because as well as letting us know how we're doing with these webinars, we also ask you to make suggestions for future topics. So right now we're scoping up the schedule for the new year, and we're really grateful to all of your suggestions and comments. We've had lots in so far and they are forming part of the schedule already. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Damion.
Thanks very much, Rich. So welcome everyone that's joining us, and if this is your first time, welcome, and for those that have joined us before, welcome again. So my name's Damion Albinson. I'm a senior consultant with PMI, and I've spent the best part of the last 20 years working in and around business improvement. It's probably worth mentioning more than half of that time was working in the aerospace sector. And in that time, I had a lot of dealings in and around 5S. So it's safe to say that I've seen the good, the bad, and certainly the ugly in terms of 5S deployments. And I've also been heavily involved in 5S as well in my time being a consultant. So what I want to cover in this webinar, firstly, this idea about whether we should start doing 5S or not in an organization. There's some things that I think that are worthy of consideration before embarking on this particular technique. I'd then like to explore some of the thinking that accompanies each step of 5S. So you know that 5S is made up of a number of steps. And then also share some of my experiences as in terms of what I've witnessed with regards to 5S deployments. And then finally finishing on some advice on perhaps how to approach 5S for greater success. So I'll get into it. So should we start a 5S deployment is a question that many organizations may face. Some may have already ventured into it. So to explore this a little further, I want to jump straight in with a poll today. And the question is this: what do you currently understand is the primary purpose of 5S? And we've highlighted the word primary there because you could argue that all of these are related in some way. So answer one: uphold a professional look of the organization, promote a safer working environment, help to recognize abnormalities, generally just keep everywhere clean and tidy, or maybe you're not sure.
Okay, so I've just launched that now and the polling should be on screen for you. And I can see people are responding already. So the good news, I know which button to press after all these weeks. So just to reiterate the question here, it is your current understanding. Don't worry about answering with question 5 if that's the case. We're trying to get a temperature of who's in the room and what the perceptions are of the topic. Sometimes known as a tool, which I think Damion will do some course correction on that theory as he progresses through his webinar. Okay, so just give you a few more moments. I can see many of you have responded already on that, and I will be able to display the results. Okay, just counting down now, and Oh, a few last minutes jumping in.
Jumping in.
Okay, great. So I'm going to end polling now. Thank you very much. And thank you. Just a reminder, anyone that is joining us on the live streams on Facebook and LinkedIn, please do let us have your comments in the chat on those video streams as well. Okay, so let's share the results on that. So Damion, what we've got is number one, uphold a professional look. Looks like it's lagging behind there in the bottom place. And then an even split. It looks like the perception here is around promoting safer working environments and help recognize abnormalities with the I'm not sures and generally keep everywhere tidy, trailing those two. Is that as you would expect, Damion?
It's a little surprising, yeah, but yeah, I'm gonna say so. I think the reason for the scores as they are is that clearly all of these things could be associated, well, apart from the last answer, could be associated with 5S. The interesting thing is about the difference between the reason for doing it versus the outcomes that you might get from doing it. I think that's why it's quite interesting that in recent times, safety has been added. In fact, some companies even add it as a 6th S. And there's lots of debate around that in the subject as to whether that's a good idea. But I think my personal view is I am on the side of saying that safety is an outcome of applying 5S, not necessarily the primary reason for doing it. So that's probably where the association is there.
And I guess there's a piece of subjectivity in there that depends on the context of the individual answering that as well. Yeah, what kind of industry then setting they're working in.
Yeah. But on upholding a professional look and keeping the place tidy, I'm going to come on and talk a little bit more about those as we go further into the slides.
Quite reassuring to see those in the positions there, I think.
Yeah, very good.
Great. Okay, I'll take those off screen. Thanks everyone for contributing.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so let's get rid of that. Okay. So our view of why to do 5S is, as a majority of people voted, it's to ensure that the environment that we create facilitates the identification of problems, or if you will, the recognition of abnormalities. So 5S is actually part of the bigger, one of the branches of that bigger subject around visual management. And if you haven't seen it already, I did a webinar a few weeks back talking about all about that. So that's its primary reason. Now, of course, what comes along with 5S in doing that and creating those environments is that you do see improvements in safety. You do have a nicer looking, cleaner, tidier, more organized working environment. But that's more of an outcome rather than a driver to do it in the first place. And I'm even going to caution, in fact, later on, the dangers of going into 5S with the mindset that it's all just really about making the place look nicer or look tidier, because that can be quite subjective and can even cause more problems perhaps than it might seem to solve. So what are abnormalities? Well, in the most basic form, they are one of these two things. So either the presence of something that should not be there. So therefore, if it's more obvious that something shouldn't be there, people can respond to it sooner and resolve the issue and fix the issue. Or it could be the absence of something that should be there. So where is that piece of equipment that I might need? Where is that file located that I desperately need to complete this piece of work? And again, if we create the right conditions, the good standards within 5S should make it really obvious to people, to the people operating the process, that these things are present or not present, and therefore they can be responded to and hopefully resolved. So there's lots of different models that describe lean, and one of the most popular ones is to show the concepts of lean and how they kind of stack up with one another in a house or a temple type diagram. And the logic behind that is that you, just like building a house, you start with the foundations and you build upwards. And you can see in here that right down there at the very bottom foundation, PMI's view on this is that you need good, solid process management before you can go on and do these more advanced things. And also supporting, so within that, within process management, we include, when we teach it to our clients, that it would include the whole idea around 5S and how to do 5S. But 5S then also supports the pillar on the right-hand side, which is called Jidoka. Jidoka is all about detecting and resolving abnormalities that are going to threaten your process in terms of either quality or delivery. And so one aspect of that can be regarded as 5S. So when we teach and help our clients to establish better process management, we use this cycle as the overarching methodology to how that should be done. So we begin at standardize, and we help people think about, what are the key things within our process, both with regards to the business process, as in doing the work, but also we include the management processes. How do we standardize those? How do we agree on the best known way? And once standards are set up and employed, the idea is then that you maintain those standards by doing certain things. And then eventually you can start to improve. And these would be small iterative improvements that then are captured again in a revised standard. So if we think about how 5S relates to this method, well, the first 4 of the S's of 5S could be regarded as all sitting within standardize. So we have to sort the area, we do the straight and the shine. Of course, 5S itself contains this step standardize. And so that gets us to that first point. Sustain, which is the last step of 5S, can be then seen as a way of maintaining those standards, which 5S is very aligned with, but also improve. And sometimes that's missed with 5S. We think that sustain is solely about maintaining the standards that we already created. If all we ever did was maintain standards that we created, we're at the risk of standing still. And as you all know, organizations and businesses change often very rapidly, and there's always a need to adapt and to follow those changes. So sustain really for me is not just about maintaining the standards, but there's an element of improve as well, which I'll allude to further in the presentation. So the thing about the cycle we just looked at is it's continuous. Once you embark on standardize, maintain, improve, it goes on forever. It's a way of describing continuous improvement. And so 5S is also part of that method. And the reason I highlight that is often 5S is referred to as just a tool, something that you use and then put away when you're finished. And a lot of organizations have made the mistake of thinking about 5S in that way. 5S is something that really requires not just commitment from the people who would be affected by the implementation of 5S, such as the process operators, but also the management. How committed is the management team to really, invest in 5S in order to make sure that it's not something that fizzles away after so many months or years. It looks like we have a question.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in via various means. Okay, so the first one, Damion, is, and where's it gone? There it is. We treat 5S as a one-off exercise. We do it a couple of times a year. In fact, we have 5S weekends a couple of times a year where we all come into work on a Saturday afternoon and tidy up. It sounds like you're suggesting there should be more to it. It's always felt like this. Is that correct?
Yes. As in, yes, there is more to it. Okay, so I'm going to elaborate on the answer. Yeah, I think, 5S is often done as a workshop. That's an okay approach to get it going. So, and if you think about the first 4 steps, I'll just back up to that slide. If you think about, sorting, straighten, shine, and then developing some standards, it is possible to do that in a very relatively short window of time. But the thing about 5S and the sustain part in particular is that that's where it's ongoing constantly. And the improve element requires us to maybe keep testing theories with regards to the strength of that standard. There's a few other elements that I that I could also put in here, but I want to save those for later. So I think, you know, it's great that you maybe choose a small area and do it as a workshop, and maybe, you know, if that's a weekend or whatever, but really it has to be ongoing. So it's not just something that you focus on in small momentary, you know, segments. It's something it really should become just part of the everyday.
And I think what I'm reading between the lines of Alan's question here is that it's needed to be done a couple of times a year in big bursts because it's not maintained the rest of the time. I think that's the case. If I am wrong, Alan, do let us know in the chat.
Sure. Yeah, and that's another thing. I think so. With a good 5S implementation, you should never really have to start from scratch. And a lot of organisations have found that that's the case. They're doing 5S for the 5th, 6th, 7th time. Suggests that something's wrong in the approach, and it could be down to this. It could be down to the commitments not lacking, perhaps, and that could be the downfall.
Okay, thanks, Damion. Cheers. Thanks, Alan.
Okay, so I wanted to share this picture with everyone. This is a photograph taken in 1943, and this is of a factory that I actually used to work at. I wasn't there in 1943. I just want to clarify that. It's a photograph of the production line building the Wellington bomber. And now for the hardcore 5S's out there might look at this and think, well, that's not really 5S. But I'm sure that most people would agree, and do let us know in the chat, that it doesn't look overly cluttered. There's not equipment strewn all over the place. There's not things being left around on the floor or hazards and so on. It's actually quite well organized. And what happened at the time, probably around the time this photograph was taken, is the plant broke a record for constructing one of these aircraft in under 24 hours. And amazingly, the thing took off 24 hours, 48 minutes after the very first parts were beginning to be put together. So quite an incredible achievement. And what's interesting about this is 5S wasn't even conceptualized until the 1950s. In Japan, and it probably wasn't adopted in and around Europe until maybe around the 1990s. So this is one of only many examples that we could have used that says, you know, that prior to 5S being around, you know, workplace organization was still a thing, right? People still valued it. So why did this plant happen to maybe have put so much of a focus and emphasis on it? It was probably down to the leadership at the time. There was a compelling need to build these aircraft faster and faster and faster, as you may well imagine. This was World War II. And so that need for the speed of the process was kind of the single aim that they would have been looking at. And therefore, in those kind of situations where there's a compelling need, understanding the need to recognize abnormalities and to have better housekeeping almost just becomes an intuitive thing that the business would need to focus on. So the case in point here is that part of leadership's role in 5S is maybe not so much just to think about how they are maybe going to go and police it once it's up and running, but what about creating the need for it to exist at all? You know, emphasizing the need for us to become quicker and faster at identifying the issues that might otherwise threaten the stability of the process. So I want to explore now some of the thinking that can go alongside the steps themselves as we go through the 5S. So I'd like to start with another poll. And this one is, in your experience, which step of the 5S's do you expect is most likely the cause of failure or failed 5S initiatives? So we've got sort, straighten, shine, standardize, and sustain. So just in case anyone's not familiar, sort is where we're figuring out what we need to keep and what we need to get rid of in a given area. Straighten is where we're creating set locations for things to be stored. Shine is about setting up a regime of cleaning. Standardize probably speaks for itself, and sustain is then trying to get it to remain forever.
And
Well,
apologies, chatting away to myself on mute. Probably best for everyone concerned. I'm smiling here to myself as I'm watching these results come in, and we will just give you a few more moments there. We've got some very definitive results.
yes, just a little.
Which I will just end that. 2 more seconds. Oh, a few more in, and we're done. Okay, so as you can see, folks, we've got a runaway indicator here on the sustain element. Perhaps not a surprise, Damion?
Not a surprise, no. I think it's probably well trodden for anyone that's been in and around 5S or even heard about it. It's well recognised that probably one of the most difficult things with 5S is the sustain part. So yeah,
and I think that plays back to the point on Alan's question earlier on as well.
Absolutely.
Certainly with the sustain.
Now, it's interesting that people have voted on some of the other parts as well, and I understand that, because in doing some of those parts as well, there are many pitfalls that organisations can fall into that can make it feel extremely difficult and challenging. So that's why I'm going to explore all of them, but certainly emphasise on the sustain part when we get to that.
Okay, fantastic. So Damion, just I'm going to stop sharing those results, and just before we progress, there's a question being put in the chat by Jan around the difference between abnormalities and problems, and are they not necessarily the same thing? I think that's worth you just elaborating upon, because the language is often used interchangeably in this area. And specifically mentioned earlier on around identifying abnormalities, I think it's worth you just elaborating on the point that they may not necessarily be problems.
That's an interesting question. I think so. My view would be that an abnormality can probably only really be identified when you've already established a standard. So an abnormal, something abnormal would be something that is recognised as it's not to standard. It's not correct. So I'm just trying to think of an example at home. If we all actually naturally organise things at home without using 5S. You don't keep the cutlery in the bedroom or something daft like that, or the bathroom. Unless you use it for unblocking sinks or something, but generally it's found in the kitchen. So if you were to suddenly see that there was a saucepan in the bathroom, you would probably immediately question why it was there, okay? Because it would seem abnormal. It's not what you would have expected. So that's how I would separate abnormalities out.
Okay, great, thanks.
No problem. Okay, so yes, so a huge proportion of people correctly identifying that sustain is probably the most difficult part of 5S. So some of you may have seen this model before in other webinars that we've presented. It's called the Gibb. We call it the Gibb model. It was based on some research by Jack Gibb, who looked into the reasons for projects that fail, and those projects were actually a whole range of categories of projects, if you will. So if we treat 5S as a project for a moment, and what his research suggested is that in order to go from a current state or current position to some desired outcome, some state in the future, there are 3 strands involved in that transition. There is the what do we need to do in terms of the tasks. There is then the how are we going to do it. And then there's the socio-emotional and political realities, which is really talking about how people feel about that whole movement and progress. And his research suggested that projects that failed, it was the socio-emotional and political realities that were hugely the reason for those failures. So how people feel about change is one of the most likely candidates to cause changes to go, off kilter. And I think that 5S is no exception to being vulnerable to exactly that. There's an awful lot of context around how people feel about it, not so much in terms of the technique, but back to this notion of, I suppose, ownership. People in organisations feel a great sense of ownership for the physical things around them, even though legally they're not theirs. You know, the tools and equipment and so on that they might use. And so for us to not involve them in any change to their environment is naturally going to create the resistance and pushback. So it's just the same as if we sent people into your homes to rearrange your personal belongings, you'd probably feel quite nervous about that. So I know I certainly would. So it's exactly the same premise with regards to 5S. So we'll take the steps one at a time then. So in terms of the sort step, what could be some of the challenges that we might encounter if we've already now decided that we're going to embark on a system of 5S? So I've mentioned already the ownership side of things. So people feel a sense of ownership, and therefore to overcome this issue, it's really important that operators are included in 5S. And the reason I say that is I've had first-hand experience of being asked to, as a team, to go into certain areas that didn't belong to us in the sense of they weren't our process, and do 5S to them because people were too busy to do it for themselves, or at least that was the theory. And of course, as much as we could make it look nice, the downside is that people weren't bought in and actually became very frustrated when some of the things they needed couldn't be found. I hasten to add this was very, very early in my improvement career, by the way. Another challenge is what history is, the legacy history is left with employees. Certain initiatives that have been badged as 5S implementation that probably were being done with the wrong driver. So I've come back to this idea of, you know, if we wanted to do 5S just to make the area look nicer or look more professional, or just generally keep it tidier, the danger is that the driver there is to make it look nice, not to help us to identify abnormalities. And I'll come back to that point on the next slide. Also, if the definition of what the process needs is poor, if we haven't grasped a very good understanding of the needs of a particular process, it's very, very difficult to go through the sort step, because one of the key decisions that you're making at this point in 5S is what are the things that I need in order to add value to the process or the product or the service. And you can't make that decision if the nature of the work is not very well defined. Another thing to consider, if there is great deals of clutter and other things that people are hanging on to, is it may be that symptomatic of other processes in the greater system being broken. So I'm a great believer that generally people don't hold on to things that they have no perceived value to them. So if people feel it necessary to hold on to, you know, spare parts or old data that we haven't used for a while, it could be symptomatic of the fact that things are maybe not so well standardized, things change on them in the moment. And the reason they hold on to these things is it helps them to get back on track. It helps, it's like the rescue effort, if you will, because they're the ones holding the pieces when the process goes wrong and something's changed unpredictably, and they've got to still get to the end of that day and produce or provide. And that's kind of linking into the second to last point there, that not considering adaptability. And what I mean by adaptability is how flexible is the 5S that you've created in terms of the standards. One of our clients did a fantastic piece of 5S work alongside their process, and they created these beautifully configured tool stations that had these pieces of foam in the drawers that meant they could reorganize all of their kit and everything was labeled. It worked really, really well until about a month later when the demand changed. And that meant that they had to rebalance the line that they were working in. And that meant that different people were now doing different tasks than they were before. And it meant that the configuration work they'd done suddenly all fell to pieces. So they'd done the right things, but they'd made it too rigid. So I think sometimes 5S implementations might seem like they're working and then suddenly fail, and they're failing because it's too rigid. It's not able to adapt to the changes in the environment. So that's a big consideration to make when doing this step. And it looks like we have another question.
Yeah, hi Damien. I've got a question on that very point, which is an interesting take from Jennifer, and it is as follows. 5S is often used in laboratories where there can be a mixture of routine and developing techniques. This can cause clashes. So by development techniques, I'm meaning new product development in this context. Is there any advice for situations where developing techniques need to keep their creativity, which I think is this adaptability point you're making, without sacrificing the standards for routine processes?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I'm not too sure I've got a perfect piece of advice for that without probably actually seeing the layout.
Mm-hmm.
But what I would say is, remember what the core principle of the 5S is. So one solution to that perhaps could be to separate the areas. It's always a challenge when areas are shared, and particularly if they're shared not necessarily by the same people, but by different processes, because it's back to the third point there about what are the needs of the process, because it's those needs that will inform what that process obviously needs, and therefore what it needs to have around it in order for it to function correctly. But you can get really creative when you think about the adaptability side. That's when you need the input of the process operators themselves to recognize that there will be situations where we go from routine to non-routine stuff. How do we still maintain some level of standard in the interests of not allowing abnormalities to affect either process? And so yeah, that can be one of the interesting challenges of doing 5S, but that's what makes it interesting. That's one of the great things about involving the operators when you do these things.
And you can also respond to this in with some creative mistake proofing techniques as well, can't you? With process to process. It depends on, as Damien said, very much the context and the specific context. But there is some very interesting mistake proofing methods that you could use, that if it's process A that's being run, it can only go in one direction or can only use certain pieces of equipment in certain ways. It's very situation specific, which is the point Damien's making about the creativity of the operators involved. So it sounds like your first point would be understanding the process in detail, I guess, Damien.
Yeah, I'd certainly support that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jennifer.
Okay, so I've alluded to this a couple of points, but this thing about tidiness, is sort really just another way, a fancy word of saying just tidy up. Or worse still, the 5S initiative is riding on the back of the desire to be tidier. The danger with that is that tidying stuff is not necessarily, it's not 5S. I'm going to lay my hand down and say that. And just think for a moment about your own experience of when someone else has tidied, quote unquote, your own personal possessions. Maybe at home is a more likely area for this to happen. And what's the result of that? Well, the thing is that people, they use their logic to rearrange your belongings, which might make perfect logical sense to them, but it doesn't to you. And therefore, all that serves to do is generate, frustrations when you can't find that thing that you desperately were sure that you left in that drawer or on that shelf. But also tidying is a case of, out of sight, out of mind. So if that's the driver behind 5S, then people just tend to hide things away in cupboards and cabinets. And of course, that does nothing for helping us to identify abnormalities, but it also creates a lack of organization, and it doesn't support the next step, which is to straighten, giving everything a set location. So it serves to create abnormalities where people can't find equipment or things go unnoticed. So I can't stress enough that if people believe that 5S is just about tidying up, they really don't understand 5S. And I'd strongly recommend to go back and research it further to grasp hold of some of the real principles that it's trying to introduce. Okay, so on to straighten, which is the next step. And the thing about straighten is that in terms of the demographic of people, you will have a spectrum of those on one side that are naturally like to be organized. Yeah, and you can maybe spot that from looking at their desks and so on. They like to have order. It's something that seems to come natural to them. Whereas other people seem to be quite comfortable in operating in a, let's say, a slightly more chaotic environment. The interesting thing when I tried to do a bit of research into this was suggested that those traits are probably from how we've grown up, because the theory being that children don't have the cognitive capacity to organize until well, certainly until they've gotten to sort of the age of something like 6 or 7 years old. So, and the environment in which they've grown up in is going to have a large emphasis over their value of being organized or disorganized. So when you're dealing with 5S in the workplace, you will have naturally a spectrum of people, some that are very much for the idea of improving how things are laid out, and others maybe that don't necessarily immediately see the value. But this photo, by the way, was a piece of work that I'd done with one of our clients who illustrated the point really. She was so ecstatic at the idea of doing 5S that she decided to put this poster on the wall. This is one of the slogans that goes along with straighten, a place for everything and everything in its place. And the reason she was so ecstatic and putting posters up is because she was naturally one of these people that liked to be tidy and organized, and was really frustrated at her colleagues that just didn't seem to share the same view. So I think that's certainly something to be considerate of. Is again, when you're doing 5, it comes back to the same point really. Involve the people who have to live and work in that environment, because you have different people in different places, and it's important to bring them all along on the journey and not just focus on those that want to immediately champion this. So I think that's a key point. Okay, so then we move on to shine. Shine is often seen as a one-off clean, and perhaps back to Alan's point earlier on from this, the twice-a-year blitz. Shine is much more than just a one-off clean. So the first thing to say is it should be regarded as a continuous regime of cleaning that said area. So it could be a schedule at which things need to be returned to some sense of order. And the other thing about shine that's often missed is the underlying principle that it's not just about cleaning, it's actually about inspection. And inspection in itself is a form of detection, and detection is the detection of abnormalities. So it brings us right back to the core reason of doing 5S. So the logic behind this is that if you have if you're cleaning something, I mean, the great example is if you think about hand washing your own car, that maybe not that many of us do these days, but it's when you do that you suddenly notice that there's a crack in the headlight, or there's a chip in the windshield, or there's a tire tread that's getting a little low. You're noticing that stuff because you're getting much closer to something that in the everyday use you wouldn't normally notice. So the same principle sits behind this for process operators, and it works particularly good in where equipment's concerned, especially old equipment. So if there's a machine with an oil stain down it and it's looked like that for the last 10 years, that oil stain might have started last night, or it might have been there for the last 16 months. Whereas if the equipment was really clean and kept clean, and we suddenly see a leak or something, we know that that's just started to happen. And now we might have a chance at being able to respond to that before that becomes a bigger problem and suddenly becomes a breakdown. And Rich?
So a comment rather than a question from Martin. Are you suggesting, I'm suggesting, and in my experience in my business, that shine, getting my operators to understand shine isn't just cleaning. is my biggest problem. Are you suggesting I'm not alone?
Yes, I think. Yeah. So yeah, it's I mean, I think one side of this as well is making sure that they have time to do it. So because operators are often, you know, under lots of pressure to meet other demands being placed on them in terms of metrics and deadlines and so on. So finding the breakout time to actually do it, I think, is also a key component of that. But I think, you know, it's only when you start doing it and really put some thought and effort into it, in terms of what they're going to clean it, and actually developing the standard for how it should be cleaned as well, that when they start to pick up those abnormalities from doing that, it suddenly then pays the dividends back in terms of the value of why it was being done. So but getting it right can be in itself iterative. You might have to experiment with different frequencies before you can get that one correct.
Yeah, and I think building on your example there of you know, the car, you're absolutely right. You only notice the stone chips when you were occasionally attempting to clean it yourself. I think my addition to your comment there, Damion, would be trying to put that kind of example in context to demonstrate to those operators of the things that they don't see and they can't see without the shine regime. And you know, it's to demonstrate that it does go beyond just the cleaning.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Damion.
That's all right. Okay, so then into the standardized step. So when we teach standardizing PMI, we refer to, in part at least, we refer to some rules as guidance for standardizing. And this applies really to standardizing anything, but it's just as applicable to 5S. So and I think the first two in particular are probably most relevant to the standardized component of the 5S steps. So the first one says standardize all important factors and nothing else. So this relates to what are the standards that we need in order to, again, comes back to recognize abnormalities. And it could be that certain things don't necessarily need to be standardized in order for people to know and follow how something should be done. So that's really important because, and I can talk from personal experience, many years ago, a team came into my office under the banner of doing a 5S deployment. I wasn't around, so they decided to just crack on without me. And they were using a technique called footprinting, which is where you mark out, usually using something like tape or paint or something, you mark out, you know, the physical kind of locations where things should be stored. And for everyone's computers in this very small office, they'd footprinted the keyboards. Now, these were keyboards that were physically attached to the PC tower and could probably move maybe a couple of inches left or right. They certainly couldn't go missing, they were plugged in. And so that level of using it as a tool to just over apply, because the idea is that you have to footprint things, was a good example of going too far with the standards. It did not add any value to the operator. And those kind of things can serve more as a frustration to people. And it comes back actually to the bigger point, which is not including the people who do the work. Had I been there, I would have been able to explain that that is not necessary. Okay, I'm quite happy that my keyboard's gonna be there tomorrow, so long as no one steals it, of course. And the second rule is, well, in fact, I've made the point, process operators must be involved. And the reason why is because they need to understand why, right? Why are certain things being standardized and other things not necessary? And they might need to understand the implication between cause and effect. So the things that they do, how that can have a large effect on the outcome, which can then in turn affect the customer, whether that be the internal or perhaps even the external customer of that process. So again, I can't stress enough, if you're going to do 5S, you have to include the people who operate and work in that environment because it's theirs. But you may need to, at the same time, guide and coach them into as you go through the steps and some of the disciplines that need to sit behind those. So lastly, it brings us into sustain, which of course was the one that stood out there on the poll that we did earlier on as being the most likely area for 5S to fall down. So first, I want to talk about the leadership side of sustain, because in a large part, sustain falls onto leadership teams and people with authority. This is where they really kind of earn their crust, and this is where they've got to put their energy into these initiatives. And I think this quote kind of probably really wraps it all up. You know, think about, would you be prepared, you know, do unto others as you would expect them to do unto you? And the reason why I thought that was a useful quote is because I've even had to coach senior people who have thought that their job was to go out there and tell people how rubbish their area still was and that they need to try harder. And that is not the idea of confirmation or indeed a way of giving feedback. So a big part of this is consider how about doing 5S to yourself first? And so I'm going to come back to that point actually, because I've got a brief story to tell if I've got enough time. So things I've witnessed that have caused 5S to be very difficult or sometimes fail within the sustain step. So over policing, people now, confirmation is a very solid part of process. Of sustain, but overdoing it and constantly being on people's back and the way in which it's done is really, really important, because it can suddenly turn it into more of a superficial exercise. Creating competition. Now, there's a lot of companies that have gone down this route where they've had, you know, literally a competition. You know, they give out a prize to the best area of the month, and the worst area of the month has to suffer some kind of punishment, maybe sit down with the big boss and explain why they're not as good as the other area. And creating competition like that on lots of levels is quite a dangerous way of trying to incentivize people. So I'm going to talk in a moment a little bit about motivation.
And we've got an advocate of that here in the comments, Damion, just to let you know, very relevant to your current point. Turning checklists into operator behavioral ratings has been observed, and then turns into a discipline issue and getting off track with the original intention and the goal of what was trying to be accomplished in the first place. Yeah. Yes, your point you're about to make about keeping the process to drive positive behaviors, just wanted to let you know that's been endorsed here in the questions.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I'm going to elaborate on that one. Lack of encouragement, so or criticism, judgment. I think that alludes to that same comment we just had. And also no interest or involvement from senior leaders. Back to one of the early slides about commitment. Everybody in the organisation should adopt 5S if it's going to be something that the organisation wants to do. It should not be seen as something that is only relevant for certain individuals and not others. And if anyone's ever read, you know, the George Orwell book, the Animal Farm scenario, you know, it's the same idea, you know, that why should it be that, you know, you do as I say but not as I do, which isn't a quote from that book, but it's still relevant. So
Glad you clarified that.
My personal experience was that as a manager many years ago, we'd been very successfully doing 5S on the shop floor area, and we had some challenges, but we were gradually making improvements. And we had a new senior leadership team come in, and they said, stop going out and confirming the condition of the shop floors with regards to 5S. And we were all, why would we do that? That's crazy. And they said, sort your areas out first. And what they meant was our office. And there was lots of different people in different offices, and the offices had never been considered, you know, as being a candidate for applying 5S. And so their logic was that how can you go out there and you know, audit people and score them or whatever, and have conversations with them is if when they come into your environment, there's no standards at all, and there's clutter and there's this, you know, things are disorganized. And it was a really, really relevant point. And I particularly remember when I was audited by a senior manager in terms of my area, and I was complaining because they pulled me up about something being on my desk, and I was complaining about, you know, not having enough storage space. And they walked no more than a couple of meters, opened up a cupboard that was in the office that didn't really belong to anybody, and it was just full of junk. And it was just one of those moments where it was like, yeah, okay, right, I need to reevaluate my sort of paradigm here, because how can I go out and sometimes challenge people to, you know, to look at their areas if I'm not demonstrating or role modeling those behaviors myself? So that was really interesting. And so, yeah, leaders not adhering to the same ethic could be another downfall. So a quote from Deming about motivation said that people are born with natural intrinsic motivation, self-esteem, dignity, curiosity to learn, joy in learning. And one of my colleagues here added a quip to that said the art of leadership, therefore, is to not kill that motivation, which I think is a really nice, interesting way to think about it. So how do you do that? So here's a fuller quote from Deming that said that when organizations when the suggested path to organizational transformation requires cooperation rather than competition. So when we use tactics like punishment or reward, in fact, which are both in themselves forms of extrinsic motivation, motivation from outside the individual, they're likely to cause these kind of more destructive behaviors, the idea of competition or fear. So instead, we need to think, how do we create and encourage this natural inbuilt motivation to learn and improve and cooperate? 5S offers us the structure in which we can do that, but it's the managers and the leadership's job to nurture the idea of getting teams to work together, to encourage them to, if they've failed against their own standards, to think about how they can improve the process of applying 5S, rather than to criticize and judge and put them at the bottom of some league table, which isn't going to encourage any motivation whatsoever. And lastly, people talk about, you know, we just need to change the culture. You know, the culture just needs to change, or blaming the culture even, that says the reason we can't make 5S work for us or it's failing is because we don't have the right culture. So how do you go about changing a culture? And there's various debates and papers on this thing, but we really like this model that says the culture is made up of elements. One of those elements is the way things are done around here, within the organization, the way people behave. And therefore, that leads into this idea of what's acceptable. What do people consider is acceptable? So it's the way things are done and what people tolerate that gives way to then the values and the behaviors that people will display in all employees. So as a leader, you've got to think about how, if you want the culture to change with regards to workspace organization, then it might start with you and what you're doing. So central to that is, you know, if we have a good process definition, if we deliver and have governance around that, we have the right management mindset, and people have the right skills and competency, that we can begin to affect the way things are done, which in themselves begins to create a change in what becomes acceptable and not acceptable. And that, I guess, is not necessarily a roadmap to how to change a culture, but some insights perhaps into how you might want to start thinking about that enormous challenge. I'm just conscious of time, so revisiting the rules for standardization, the rules 3 and 4 seem to apply better to the sustain part. So managers, technical experts, your role in sustain is to support the process operators. in lots of different ways. And the purpose of any review, or confirmation as we call it, should be for learning, not to go out there and reprimand people, or worse. And if you start to do that more, you'll find that you get more engagement, you get more interest, and people start to develop that own motivation to want to use 5S as a vehicle to improve their areas. So finally, some advice for leadership. I think, so being aware of the shadow that you cast, because that in itself can have a huge influence on sustaining 5S. Applying it to your own work areas, maybe first. And if you're already well into a 5S initiative, maybe stop for a moment and consider, have you applied it in your environment, in your digital environment, or in your office space, or something like that, in order to role model. And not just that, not just the role model principle, but to learn from it as well. I found it extremely difficult to maintain some of the standards that we created for ourselves. And it makes you more appreciative of the challenges, therefore, that the people in the business process face when they're trying to maintain these standards. Sometimes it's easy to slip. So I think it's a great learning platform to apply this to yourself first, for you to learn about it from direct experience before maybe then trying to encourage others to follow suit. And so clearly be seen to adhere to any 5S standards that do exist, and get involved, encourage people, ask them how they're, what's their next improvement idea for their 5S condition, what are they finding a challenge, what are they finding of value. So I think they're my final words of advice for leadership to think about. And it looks like we might have another question.
So Damion, yeah, just to let you know, I'm going to propose we run on till 5:05, because we've got quite a number of questions that I think are worthwhile, just to let everyone know. Yep.
Cool. Okay, so last bit. So the summary of 5S. So 5S is primarily about improving abnormality detection. It should not be regarded as a tool, but rather this ongoing approach as part of continuous improvement. Be aware that some individuals naturally favour order more so than others, so therefore they may need guidance. And leadership's role is to create the compelling need for 5S to be a solution to the situation that the process is in. And lastly, the culture is only going to change if everyone at every level embraces the concept and embraces it in a way that means they demonstrate it through application and not just words or commitment.
Okay, fantastic. So bear in mind the time, let's get to some of these questions. I know some of you will need to move on to other meetings. So right down to practicalities, Damion. One for you here from Don. What have you found better, to implement 5S in one area and use that as a learning tool for others, or to implement 5S in all areas at once?
The former, I think. I think it's very wise, especially if it's the first time out with it, to do it in small areas and then learn from that and take that learning into the next area. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think I'll keep that answer. I could go on with that in terms of a story, but I won't tell any more. Yeah, I think do it in small, because if you take on a really large area, it can become overwhelming, and suddenly then the sustain part becomes so challenging that it's almost like gets put in the too difficult box. So start off small, grow it from that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Don, for the question. Also, comment about physical environments as well, Damion. About taking the opportunity to build the 5S standards into the physical environment itself. I wonder if you've got any kind of observations of success where that's worked.
Yeah, I think the more you do that, the better. I mean, so again, especially in physical environments, the more obvious you can make it. A good acid test of a strong 5S in an area should be that even a stranger coming into the area would recognize an abnormality. So there's a real kind of acid test to think, how clear are the standards in the area? So color coding things, marking out where things should be on the floor. I mean, think of simple things like if you're in a building, where's the fire exit? where if you look around, you'll see it. There's a signage there that tells you where it is. So you can make things more obvious with simple things and cues like visual aids and color coding and those kind of things. So yeah, I think the more obvious you make it, the better.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point with the kind of notice that you showed on the picture earlier on your slide. It needs to go well beyond the everything in its place and answer the question: how do I know everything is in its place? What are the physical things that can tell me that? And one not so much about psychology, but a very specific question from Carol. When talking about detecting abnormalities, am I right in thinking control charts could have a role to play?
Absolutely, because that is in essence what a control chart does. It tells you with regards to variation, if that variation is the natural variation that we should always expect to see, known as common cause, versus if that variation is assignable, which means it's abnormal in nature. So a control chart is a statistical way of detecting abnormalities when we're taking measurements. So yeah, absolutely. It's obviously not perfectly aligned with 5S in that sense, but yeah, it's nonetheless, again, like I say, 5S is a branch of visual management, and visual management in itself has the sole aim of making abnormalities more obvious, so that you can respond to them. So yeah, a control chart is another technique, and there's many others as well. So yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Cool. Thanks, Damion, and thanks everyone for your questions on all the streams. I apologize that we haven't had time to get to them all. Damion, if you just quickly nip to the next 2 slides. Just a quick reminder, folks, we are still running our public course training incentive. Anyone that books on any of our public course training courses to attend them virtually, they are fully virtualized. We supply you with a brand new Apple iPad, and it's yours to keep at the end of the course. So check out the web address on screen there. And then finally, on the last slide, we have, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we have published the December schedule. The New Year schedule is in progress at the moment. So when you do receive the Voice of the Customer survey, please do add your comments, because we'd love to tailor this as much as possible to your feedback. So if there's something on today's webinar you'd like us to go into further detail in the webinar in its own right, please let us know, and I'll be delighted to set Damion the task of writing that webinar. So thank you very much for everyone. Apologies for the overrun in the time. Do look out for the survey. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. So on behalf of PMI, Damion, and myself, it's our privilege to host you. So thank you very much for joining us, and we wish you all safe and relaxing weekends. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you all.